Marvel Comics was a huge part of growing up for me. My friends and I would always talk about who had the best powers, who could defeat who in a fight, and who was the most menacing villain. Marvel gave birth to classic heroes like Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and the X-Men, just to name a few. Once Marvel properties found their way to the Sega Genesis, it started a more than dozen game run across multiple popular properties. In this episode, we will go over many of these releases and see how they fared. Did they capture the essence of what made the comic book so great? Let's find out. It would be wrong of me to not start this journey off and not mention the Revenge of Shinobi. Released in late 1989 and developed by Sega itself, this was the very first instance of a Marvel character showing up on the Sega Genesis. During a boss encounter on stage 6, Spider-Man himself would crawl out and begin to attack you. At first he throws webs to slow you down, and then he does a sort of charge attack that damages you. He then reveals himself to be a shapeshifter, and turns into none other than a creature that resembles DC Comics' Batman. The level of design similarities here greatly depend on the version of the game you play. Initially, Sega did not have the rights to use the Spider-Man character. In some revisions, Spider-Man looks more like Spider-Man and Batman looks more like Batman. Other revisions, it's the exact opposite. Still, it was supremely cool seeing Spider-Man show up in such a cool game, but it would not be his last. Spider-Man vs. the Kingpin was a Sega-developed 1991 release for the Genesis that I thought was just okay. That dastardly Kingpin is gonna blow up the city, and you have just 24 hours to collect the keys to stop him. The gameplay is a strict action platformer, but of course, being everyone's favorite web crawler, you can also attach yourself to walls and ceilings. This gives you the added advantage of avoiding enemies you normally couldn't. When you finally do face down an enemy, you can punch, kick, and use your webbing. Be mindful of your webbing gauge because you get a limited supply. It uses a cool mechanic of taking pictures that you can use to buy more webbing, and returning home to rest to heal. Many of Spider-Man's popular adversaries make an appearance, everyone from Dr. Octopus, to the Sandman, to even Venom himself. Stages range from the city streets, warehouses, sewers, and Central Park. You can thank this game for Sega's eventual relationship with Marvel, because it sold very well for the platform. A Sega CD edition would follow it up, adding a less linear structure and enhanced story cinematics. "1992 brought us support of the Data East arcade game Captain America and the Avengers. This was a big one because multiplayer beat-em-ups were extremely popular at the time. Add in the fact you could play as Captain America, Iron Man, Hawkeye, or Vision, and you had one heck of an adventure. In this one, the evil Red Skull is up to no good, and has the ability to use mind control on other bad guys and bend them to his will. The Avengers must assemble and stop them all before facing the final challenge. The color and overall visuals do suffer a bit in this one, but as far as stages, enemies, and gameplay, it's a fair approximation of the original. Console editions include a training mode where the heroes can battle one another in direct combat. Your enjoyment of this will likely hinge on whether or not you enjoy the IP and the genre itself, but overall I'd say it's worth a bit of your time, especially for the game's incredible soundtrack. Spider-Man showed up again in 1993 with acclaimed Spider-Man and the X-Men in Arcade's Revenge. It was developed by Software Creations and has the supervillain Arcade capturing the X-Men and forcing them to fight their way out of his amusement park death. You must use Spider-Man, Wolverine, Gambit, Storm, and Cyclops and overcome each of their specific challenges. It's not just the amusement park that's a danger either. You also have to contend with the likes of Juggernaut and Carnage. It's not a great looking game, coming off as more of something you would have seen on the Master System rather than the Genesis, and the sound wasn't all that impressive either. The stage design is haphazard and sometimes it's not immediately clear where you can and can't go. While average, the gameplay is far from broken, so I would advise those of you that enjoy the characters to have a look at it. It's one of those games you can't help but to feel it could have been so much better if it had just a bit more development time. Also in 1993 came the Sega-published X-Men, a game that was developed for them by Western Technologies, the company behind the Joe Montana 92 and 93 titles. In this one, Magneto has found a way to infect the Danger Room with a malicious virus that turns it against the X-Men. As Gambit, Nightcrawler, Wolverine, and Cyclops, you must make your way through everything the Danger Room throws at you until you figure out what you need to do to bring it under control. You get to choose which member of the team you control, and there are a few others that show up in a supporting role like Storm, Rogue, Archangel, Iceman, and Jean Grey. I thought this one had a ton of potential, but the gameplay was a bit shallow. The difficulty is sky high, and it sounded a bit rough at times. The overall package is not a bad game though, it just wasn't up to the normal standards set by a game released by Sega. Where this one gets a significant boost in appeal is the 2-player co-op. It elevates the experience, and if you have someone to play with, that's the route you want to take. $1994 would be a huge year for Marvel releases, and we start with Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage. This single-player beat-em-up was an acclaimed release that I just couldn't get behind. It was so repetitive and had none of the things the better entries in the genre had to break it up. The sound, graphics, and animations are all okay, but nothing special, and the massive amount of stages means you'll get tired of it about halfway through. It has a number of cameos from other Marvel heroes like Captain America, but these are fleeting and have no long-term effect on the appeal. The largest head-scratcher has to be the one-player-only story. How hard would it have been for one of those cameos to be a permanent partner for Spidey or Venom? It would have taken this one up a notch and made it far more palatable. As it is, it's a serviceable beat-em-up that gets old really fast. It needed more moves, grapples, and special attacks to even come close to the standard set by games like Streets of Rage. Of note, some versions of this game came on a special red cartridge. US Gold and Probe was responsible for 1994's The Incredible Hulk. I really love the animation, the layered backgrounds, the speed, and some of your moves, but it's second fiddle to the difficult gameplay. When you first play it, you will be absolutely smothered with enemies that take entirely too many hits to defeat and their unrelenting weapon fire. It's gonna pound casuals into the ground quickly. Fortunately, there is a decent game hidden under that once you find the power-ups, learn the enemy placement, and take better advantage of the gameplay speed. It's that speed that must be mastered so you can get to the enemies before they have a chance to tee off on you. Should you have the patience to endure a few dozen deaths to get there, I really do think there is enough here to really get behind. Hulk has a number of cool power moves and grapples, and there's even some hidden areas that must be navigated by your much weaker form Bruce Banner. My best advice here is to move fast on your enemies and make sure you find the continue coins hidden around the stages, because you're gonna need them. Acclaim was back with another Marvel game in 1994, this time the Wolverine-focused Adamantium Rage. This delves into the deeper story of where Wolverine came from and who was responsible. It has a number of references, locations, and enemies from past comic books, and fans should absolutely love it for that. Sadly, the slow animations, damage sponge enemies, and sluggish gameplay really make this one a headache at times. It isn't unplayable, and there is some fun to be had once you learn the stage layouts, but you can't help but feel this was just a few steps away from being a much better game. Had Wolverine's animation been faster for his movements and attacks, this could have gone from average to something worth talking about. For those of you interested in the Super Nintendo version, that has a very different layout and feel, plus it's far more difficult, making the Genesis edition the preferred version in my opinion. I also thought it looked pretty good on the old Genesis. Acclaim kept the Marvel ball rolling with 1995's Spider-Man, also known as Spider-Man the Animated Series. Like the previous Wolverine title, this was also released on the Super Nintendo, and it has a number of differences here. The sound and visuals are a notch weaker, and the stages have layout and design differences. But the big issue with every version of this game is that it plays like absolute dog shit. It's a herky-jerky mess that lacks any smoothness or finesse to any of its moves. It also only uses a 3-button interface for a game clearly designed for more buttons. There are multiple functions per button, and it's incredibly easy to do something you didn't mean to do or miss an action entirely. Add that to the rather mundane objectives, damage sponge enemies, and terrible music, and this is an adventure only for die-hard Spidey fans. Acclaim gets some points for developing different versions of these games for the two 16-bit platforms, but when they both have this many issues, it makes them quite the acquired taste. I'd also like to take a moment and bring up the opening vocals and music to this turd. It is quite possibly the most offensive oral example to have come out of this hardware. In 1995, Capcom put out a Genesis port of their Punisher arcade game. This was developed by Sculptured Software and came on a 16 megabit cartridge, a far smaller footprint than the content on which it's based. This means that despite a playable co-op beat-em-up, it is cut back heavily from the arcade edition in every possible way. The animations, sounds, details, I mean everything is a shadow of its former glory. Lucky for us, the arcade was so damn good, there's enough left here to still be worth a go, especially with a friend in tow. You know this story well. Frank Castle's family is murdered by the crime boss Kingpin, leaving him a broken man. He emerges from his grief as the Punisher, and nothing's gonna stop him from getting revenge. You get guns, knives, grenades, flamethrowers, and much more to murder the bad guys. Nick Fury is along for the ride, and you have multiple stage locations to battle across. No, it's not the arcade, but it's still a fun curiosity because it was the only home conversion of this game ever created, and it was only on your Sega Genesis. "1995 gave us perhaps the best Marvel-related Sega game yet in X-Men 2 Clone Wars. It was developed for Sega by Head Games, makers of previous titles like Pink Goes to Hollywood and Taz and Escape from Mars. It has one of the best openings in any game ever, throwing you into the Siberian tundra with a random X-Men character and no story or reasoning for your adventure. You'll eventually get to play as Wolverine, Cyclops, Gambit, Nightcrawler, Beast, Psylocke, and even Magneto. This loosely follows the comic arc of the Phalanx, an alien organism that infects and controls all life it comes in contact with. It can even clone mutant abilities. There aren't but 6 different stages in this one, but each stage has sub-levels and multiple bosses to face. These stages are fun and designed well to take advantage of your X-Men abilities. It still has a rather brutal difficulty, however. Be prepared to die a lot as you learn the stage layouts, but fans of the property should find that easy to do since each of the playable characters have their own powers to exploit. When it comes to Marvel releases on the Genesis, this one is in a class all its own. Acclaim wasn't done with its Marvel licenses, and they had one more in them with 1995's Venom and Spider-Man Separation Anxiety, a direct sequel to 1994's Maximum Carnage. This doesn't stray too far from its predecessor, this time including the 2-player mode the original sorely needed. That alone should make this one a better game, but once you add in all the weaknesses of the previous title and an absolutely broken difficulty level, this game is far, far worse. No kidding. Getting through this with no continues is crazy, and some of these boss fights are just plain insane. Only the most dedicated will find their way forward without any cheat codes. The first game's repetition is back and just as overbearing, again pitting you against the same enemies for far too many stages. Still, with a friend this can be tolerable as you both sit back and laugh your way through the countless ass whoopings you'll receive. Break out a beer and don't take it seriously, and it's worth a night's entertainment. We wrap up our Marvel coverage with a game that was never released, X-Men: The Sinister Virus. This was to be a 1996 follow-up to Clone Wars, focusing on the mutant women and having gameplay centered on lots of flying mechanics. Magazines talked about it for months, and there was even a promotional video showing off the work in progress. After slipping into 1997, it was eventually cancelled, never seeing the light of day. Another unfortunate casualty of its demise is that the developer Clockwork Tortoise went with it. They were the developers behind the popular Adventures of Batman and Robin for the Genesis, a sad end to a talented group. X-Men was cancelled very deep into development, so there is likely a nearly finished game ROM out there somewhere. As you can see, the Marvel license was a wild ride of ups and downs on the Genesis. Almost all of this was developed by Western studios and teams, which at the time weren't exactly known for a wealth of quality, particularly when it came to the Genesis. In fact, there is music among this bunch that is appallingly atrocious, easily among the worst for the device. Back then, it was fairly standard for a publisher to obtain a license like Marvel, throw a team on it, and get it out as soon as possible. That didn't leave a lot of time for fine-tuning, and there is more than one where you'll say to yourself, this is almost a really good game, it just needed a bit more time. The good news is that a few, particularly Sega's X-Men games and the Avengers port, that remain quite fun and worth a go today. I won't downplay the power of nostalgia for the other games, however. While many of them had issues that will turn away a casual player, you often played what you had as a kid until you found the good in it. And all of these had the makings of very decent games. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.